Hey y'all, so today I'm going to answer the question, should you start a nonprofit in 2021? Let's get into it. Hey, this is Tiffany with Boss on a Budget. I help new and small nonprofits get up and running. If you need help with your nonprofit, don't forget to subscribe to my channel because I drop a video every single week. All right, y'all, so let's answer the question. Is it the time? Is now the time to start a nonprofit given all the crap that we're dealing with as a result of COVID-19? So I'm going to give you 3 things to consider in making a decision. And at the end, I'm going to also give you some advice to how to move forward if you decide that a nonprofit is for you. And to be very specific, I'm talking about 501c3 public charity nonprofits. And if you need to know the difference between a public charity and a private foundation, check out this video because I break it down in that video for you. All right, so the first thing you should ask yourself if you're thinking of starting a nonprofit in 2021 is there an actual need for what I'm trying to do in the community? And I would give this advice if it was 2019 or if it was 2025. I would just give this advice anyway, because you should not be starting a nonprofit if you haven't validated or done some kind of assessment to see whether or not what you're trying to do is actually needed or wanted in your community. So here's an example of what I mean. Say you want to serve youth who are exiting from detention centers. They have some kind of offense and they're trying to transition back home. And you feel like they need etiquette classes and you want to focus on health and wellness. But in reality, what they really need help with and what they're asking for is education, career development, or some kind of workforce development. So by you trying to force something that you want to do into something that's not going to work, or it's not going to be effective, you're going to make it very difficult for you to survive moving forward, especially in the landscape that we're moving in, where a lot of funders are not sure what they want to do because they're not sure how the economy is going to look moving forward. So I would suggest that if you're trying to start a nonprofit, you ask yourself, is the community even asking for this? Is this something that's going to be effective? Is this something that people are even going to want to support or care about? Because your job as a nonprofit founder is to convince people to give to you. It's to convince people to support you. A very large portion of the activities that you're going to do as a founder is trying to gather up support. And you have to make sure that there's even an interest, right? People are even going to want to get behind you, and you need to do that work before you even get started to make sure you're going down the right path. And the last thing I'll say on this is a lot of times when you want to start a nonprofit, you start with the what. You have something in your head that you want to do, a specific activity that you want to carry out. But a lot of times, nonprofit founders don't really think about why they want to do it. Why is there a need for what you want to do? And people are going to care less about what you do and more about why. People are going to want to get behind why this is so important, why now. And you're going to have to learn how to build that sense of urgency. But if there is nothing there, if you haven't done that validation and people just don't care, you're going to make it very hard on yourself. The second thing you need to think about is maybe a nonprofit is not the answer for what you're trying to do. So I see a lot of people say, I want to do an annual coat drive. And so I want to start a nonprofit to do that. And a lot of people automatically assume that if you want to do something charitable, that the next step is to start a whole nonprofit organization. And I would caution you and say, is that necessary? Because there are other options that you can consider rather than just creating a whole organization. Because starting a nonprofit is no joke. So you have to recruit and maintain a board of directors. You have to adhere to state requirements and state annual filings. There are multiple filings that you have to do. Then you have to worry about the IRS and the rules and the regulations and your annual report to the IRS. And it's a huge learning curve, and it takes a lot of time to get it done and do all that paperwork, right? So is it worth that? If all you're trying to do is every year just do a coat drive, is it worth having to put a board together and having to do all of that administrative stuff? So you need to ask yourself whether or not you really want to go through the whole process of starting a nonprofit. Here are some other options you may want to consider. First, maybe you want to do it as a project and do it under the umbrella of another nonprofit. So maybe there's a nonprofit that does similar work or serves your population that you're interested in, and maybe you can approach them and say, I want to do this project and partner with you every year to serve your clients. There are a lot of nonprofits who would jump at the chance for that, so you may want to consider that. You can also do it under the guise of a fiscal sponsor. So if you don't necessarily want to partner, you want to kind of maintain some sense of autonomy and do your own thing, but you still don't want to do like the whole application process and get a 501c3, you may consider having a fiscal sponsor. And that is when an organization allows you to use their 501c3 tax exempt status. Now you have to have an agreement in place, and there's more than likely going to be a fee for doing that. But you can use their status so that people feel comfortable donating to you and people can write off their donations to you. So that's another option. One option also may be you don't have to do it under the guise of anything. You don't have to have an organization. You can just do something nice every single year, and that's fine. The drawbacks in that is that you don't get any tax benefits from that. People don't get a tax benefit from donating to you. And if you're collecting money, that's going to show as income to you. Like if you're collecting thousands and thousands of dollars, that looks like income into your bank account. And so you just really need to be careful and consider the tax implications of doing that. Another option is maybe you have a for-profit business and maybe you just want to do it under the guise of that business. Maybe you want that business to do a coat drive or a toy drive every year, and there may be some tax benefits of you doing that. Now, people won't get tax benefits for donating to your for-profit, but there may be benefits to you as a business doing something like that. So that's one option you may consider as well. And then the other thing people don't think about is whether or not you should be a foundation. So when I talk to people on the phone and they're asking me for advice to what to start and how to do it, a lot of times what they're describing to me is a private foundation, not necessarily a public charity. So a public charity is what we typically consider a regular nonprofit. They do charitable work, they provide direct services in the community. But a private foundation is different. They actually collect funding and they actually grant money to public charities. And some hybrids, so they're called private operating foundations, they're a hybrid of the two, can do kind of a mix of both. But as a foundation, if, for example, you want your family to be on the board, it's much more lenient on stuff like that to be a private foundation. The IRS is much more lenient than a public charity. Because if you're a public charity, the IRS recommends no more than 49% of the people on the board be related. You have to manage those conflicts of interest and disclose it. It can get tricky and messy. Whereas with the private foundation, there's, less concern about that. There's still some issues around self-dealing that you need to be mindful of, but it's less of an issue when you're a private foundation. Also, if you're a private foundation, it's okay for you to get all of your money from one single source, right? It's okay. But as a public charity, the IRS actually frowns on that. The IRS expects you to get your money from multiple places, not just your pockets. So if you're only trying to finance it through your family or through something that you're doing as a part of your business, you may need to consider opening a foundation and not a public charity nonprofit. There are so many different options you can consider. I would say talk to your community foundation. You may be able to open a trust, or they may work with you to kind of manage your funds and help you grant your funds. But it may just be that you need to be a foundation and not a public charity. Okay, so the last thing you need to consider is what's the industry that you're trying to open your nonprofit in. So there are some industries that have been hit really, really hard by COVID. I'm thinking about arts organizations, cultural organizations, any of those organizations that relied heavily on in-person interaction, that relied heavily on performances and events to survive. They have been hit really hard. And there's one study that says of just museums. So let's just take the museum industry. 53% of museums across the country have had to furlough or lay off their staff, and a third of them have said that they don't know if they'll be able to survive and they may have to permanently close as a result of COVID. So they've been hit really hard. So if you're trying to open a museum right now, that may not be the move for you. The other thing is there are certain industries where the need has actually increased. So there's a study of leaders of color around the country that says there's an increased need in food assistance, jobs, housing, COVID-19 related illnesses and health issues, and a lot of stuff dealing with the economy, which you can naturally think that, yeah, we see that every day in our communities, that there's an increased need. So your community may not have the current capacity to address all of those rising needs. So that's a signal to you that it may be the right time for you to step in and try to fill those gaps that have been exposed by COVID. But again, whether or not, whatever industry you're trying to start in, you really need to consider whether or not you have a strong fundraising plan. You need to be clear about where you want your money to come from, and you need to examine all of those income sources to make sure it's viable for you moving forward. For example, if you expect that all of your funding is going to come from grants, and I'm just going to say right now, don't do that, but I know a lot of you think that. But let's just go with the example. If you think that most of your funding is going to come from grants, then you really need to check out the funders who would likely fund your organization and see what they're doing. Because there are a lot of funders who've said, we're not going to give to new organizations. We're just going to focus on who we've given to, the people that we know and the people that we trust. Okay? But there are some foundations that have been completely open and actually expanding and funding more. So you really should do your research regardless to make sure that the funding is actually there for you. So I'm just going to hit you with 3 pieces of advice before I close out this video, just to be mindful of if you're trying to start a nonprofit. And again, this is not just for COVID-19, but especially in this time, you should be asking yourself these questions and making sure you have this stuff in place. So number 1, do you have a strong fundraising plan in place? Just like I just talked about in the last tip. You need to make sure that you're clear where your money is coming from. You need to make sure that you're clear on what it will cost to actually do the work you're trying to do. And you need to have a strategy and a plan in place to try to make that money. And you need to examine the industries around you. You need to examine the trends to make sure that your fundraising plan is actually realistic and it's going to get you what you need. The second question you need to ask yourself is, do I have a strong communications plan in place? You're going to be very surprised once you get started that a lot of the work you do is not necessarily direct services. It's actually communications and marketing. All right. So your bread and butter, how you survive, is getting your name out there and getting people to know more about you and getting people to support you, because that's how you warm people up to eventually being your donors, by communicating with them, by doing presentations, by putting out information on social media about the work that you're doing. That's how you build up a donor base, by getting your name out there. So you need to have a strong communications and marketing plan in place. The third thing I would ask myself is, do I have a strong team that's going to back me up? A lot of people want to start their nonprofits because it's a personal vision. It's a dream that, God has given them or God has spoken to them. And that's great, but you cannot execute that vision on your own. I'm going to say it one more time. You cannot execute that vision on your own. So you need to have a strong team around you, because when you have to start serving your clients, when you have to fundraise, when you got to do communications and marketing, it's going to get overwhelming really quickly. So you need to ask yourself, who can I put in place? Who can I trust to make sure that this work gets done, and who can do this with me? If you need help trying to decide whether or not you want to start a nonprofit, check out my Before You Start workbook. That helps you kind of lay out a process and a plan for deciding whether or not you should start your nonprofit and all the things you should do to prepare. So check that out in the description box below. And if you have questions for me, always visit me at www.bossonabudget.com, and I'll see you in the next video.